Welcome to the Literature Cafe. Today and over the next few weeks, we'll be diving into some of Karl Marx's most influential ideas with a specific focus on his analysis of capitalism. So Marx wrote Capital while living in London during the peak of the Industrial Revolution, and the city actually offered a perfect case study for him. So on one hand it was a center of industrial growth and progress, but on the other it was plagued by extreme poverty, and Marx saw firsthand the harsh conditions that workers, including women and children, were subjected to in factories. So they worked grueling hours for barely enough to survive, while factory owners raked in massive profits. And this glaring contrast between the wealth of the few and the misery of the many is what drove Marx to dig deeper into the mechanisms of capitalism. And in Capital, Marx conducted a forensic examination of how capitalism works. So how value is created, how capital is accumulated, and most importantly, how profit is extracted at the expense of labor. But actually these are not just abstract ideas for philosophy students, they are crucial for anyone trying to understand the system we live in today. But before we dig deeper into the more complex economic theories like surplus value and exploitation, we need to lay some groundwork, because there are a few key concepts that will help us better understand Marx's critique of capitalism, and today we'll focus on three main ideas. So historical materialism based on superstructure and also class struggle. And without further ado, let's start with the first foundational idea, historical materialism, the core of Marx's theory. So Marx's starting point is actually quite simple and straightforward. So as human beings, we have material needs, so we all need to eat, drink, and find shelter to survive. And if we don't meet these needs, nothing else matters. And Marx puts it simply: life involves, before everything else, eating and drinking, housing and clothing, and various other things. The first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy these needs, the production of material life itself. Marx argues that it doesn't make sense to start a philosophical theory by talking about God, morality, or justice if we haven't first explained how people actually satisfy their basic material needs. And what Marx is getting here is that all human societies are defined by how we produce the things we need to survive. And this is also what separates us from animals. So animals find food and consume it directly from nature. But we as human beings, on the other hand, have to produce our food, clothing, and shelter by our own. So we alter our environment, we invent tools, we work together in complex social systems to meet these needs. So let's take, for example, a farmer. So a farmer grows crops, but they obviously don't do it by themselves. So the fertilizer might come from one place, the tractor might come from a factory, and the fuel for the tractor comes from an oil refinery. And after the crops are eventually harvested, they go to a supermarket where people can purchase them. And this entire process is very complex, so it involves so many people. And Marx emphasized that, unlike animals, human beings survive only by dividing labor and cooperating with one another. So he writes, labor, therefore, is a necessary condition, independent of all forms of society, for the existence of human race. It is an eternal, nature-imposed necessity, without which there can be no material exchanges between man and nature, and therefore no life. So the key first takeaway is that human beings define themselves through work and through their relationship to material production. Now Marx introduces another important concept of base and superstructure. But what exactly does Marx mean by this? think of society like a house. So the base is like the foundation of this house, representing the economic system that society is built upon. And this base consists of everything related to the production of material goods. So factories, machines, tools, lands, or also labor. And it includes the relations of production, so how work is divided and organized, and the forces of production. And the base fundamentally determines how society organizes its material needs, such as food, shelter, and clothing. And without this foundation, the rest of society, so the house, would not function. And built upon this base is the superstructure, which includes all the non-economic aspects of society, like culture, laws, politics, religion, or also education. And these are the more visible surface-level elements of society, like the rooms and also the structures that we can see and interact with every day. But however, according to Marx, the superstructure is ultimately shaped by the base. So it's the economic foundation of society that influences and conditions the culture, laws, and institutions that emerge from it. And this is key. It's the base that determines the superstructure and not the other way around. So Marx basically flips the idea of earlier philosophers like Hegel, who believed that human consciousness, so our ideas, drives history forward. But Marx disagrees, so he argues that it's not our ideas that shape the world, but rather the material conditions of production. And as he famously puts it, it's not consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness. This means that if we want to understand how our society operates, we first need to look at how that society produces goods and organizes labor. So let's break this down with an example. So in feudal societies, where land ownership was the primary source of wealth, the dominant ideas reflected this structure. The ruling class, or the feudal lords, justified their power by claiming divine right. So they said that God had chosen them to rule, and therefore their position of power was natural and just. But Marx points out that these ideas didn't arise from nowhere. They were a reflection of the economic base. Land was the main source of wealth and power in feudal society. So the superstructure, the beliefs, the religion, the political system justified and reinforced this economic system. And now let's move forward to capitalist societies. Just like in feudalism, the superstructure in capitalist societies is shaped by the economic base. The dominant ideas in capitalism or in capitalist societies is the belief in free markets and individualism, and also the idea that hard work leads to success. And all this serves to justify this exploitation of the working class. And these ideas are not neutral. They are designed to maintain the power of the ruling class and make the system seem natural and unchangeable. And this brings us to Marx's critique of ideology. So for Marx, ideology isn't about any set of ideas. It's a system of beliefs that justifies and sustains the existing power structures and makes exploitation and inequality seem normal and natural. Ideology, in this sense, works like a mask, so hiding the true nature of capitalism and the exploitation that occurs within it. And now let's take a closer look at how this works. In capitalist societies, workers sell their labor to a capitalist in exchange for wages. And this actually seems like a fair deal, right? So both sides appear to benefit. But Marx points out that this is only one part of the story, because beneath the surface, the worker is being exploited. But I will explain this in depth in the next video. But for this video, this unequal exchange is masked by the ideology of free trade and equal opportunity. And Marx puts it, the wage form appears as the whole story about the relation between capital and labor. ignoring the exploitation which occurs in the sphere of production. In other words, ideology hides the exploitation at the heart of capitalism, making it appear as the wage system is fair and equal. But ideology doesn't stop there. It's also reinforced by the institutions that shape our thinking, such as media, education, and the legal system. And these institutions are controlled by the ruling class, and they help spread these ideas that justify the existing system. And the ideology of capitalism helps stabilize the system by convincing workers that their exploitation is just a part of life or even something beneficial. But as Marx warns, ideology isn't just misleading, it actively maintains the power of the ruling class. And he famously writes, "The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ruling ideas of its ruling class." So in capitalist societies, those who control the material base, so the bourgeoisie, also control the dominant ideas, values, and beliefs. And they use these ideas to justify their position of power and make it seem as the current social order is both natural and unchangeable. Marx believed history is essentially a series of stages in how society organized their production. He believed that throughout human history, different social classes have come into conflict over the control of resources and production, and these conflicts, according to Marx, often lead to revolutions, which then change the way societies are run and how their economies work. So back then, people lived together in simple tribal societies, and these societies were concerned above all with survival. And survival was achieved through collective production, and everything was shared, and there was no concept of private property. Marx and Engels refer this as Gentile societies. As Marx puts it, production in all previous stages of society was essentially common production, and likewise consumption took place by the direct distribution of the products within larger or smaller communist communities. And now think about how North American indigenous tribes would go on buffalo hunts and then share the meat among all the tribe members. So these early societies were classless, meaning no one owned more than anyone else, and there were no haves and have-nots. So private property didn't make sense in these societies because everything belonged to the community, and what mattered was survival, not accumulation. For example, when a tribe moved to follow the herds, they couldn't carry much. They only had a few essential items. No one hoarded goods because they couldn't carry them. There was no division of labor, no money, just a basic communal existence. And Engels described these societies as healthy and unselfish. And here's how he puts it. As long as production was carried on this basis, it could not grow beyond the control of the producers, and it could not conjure up any alien phantom power against them, as it is the case regularly and inevitably under civilization. But of course, this wasn't the end of history. As humans developed agriculture and began to settle down, things changed. Instead of hunting and gathering, societies now started to produce a surplus of food. They stored it, traded it, and soon the idea of private property began to emerge. And this is also where class society begins. Along with private property also came slavery. Human beings became property too. Marx and Engels make a distinction between Asian and European slave-owning societies, but the important point is this. Once private property entered the picture, society became divided between those who owned and those who labored. And Marx's most famous statement sums up what follows. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So in every society that came after primitive communism, there is always a conflict between two classes, the oppressor and the oppressed. So, for instance, in ancient times, we see the conflict between masters and slaves. Later, in feudal society, the conflict between lords and serfs. The ruling class, whether they are slave owners or feudal lords, controls the means of production, so land, resources, tools, while the working class has to labor to survive. But this class conflict isn't just an unfortunate accident of history, because according to Marx, it is an engine that drives history forward. He says, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted fight, a fight that each time ended in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large. Now let's zoom in on feudal society, which existed before capitalism. In feudal society, the nobility owned the land and the peasants worked it. So the lords and even the kings lived entirely off what the peasants, merchants, and craftsmen produced. The nobility didn't engage in labor. Working with one's hands was seen as beneath them. And they carried even parasols to distinguish themselves from the sunburned peasants, and they rejected trade and banking as activities beneath their dignity. But by leaving trade and commerce in the hands of others, the nobility unintentionally raised up the new class, the bourgeoisie, which was based in the towns and cities. And these were the traders, the merchants, and the manufacturers. And this new bourgeois class soon became much wealthier than the old nobility. While the lords clung to their rural estates and collected rents, the bourgeoisie set up workshops and even the first factories. So wealth flowed into the towns, and the power of the bourgeoisie grew. And soon the nobles found themselves deeply in debt to this new class of traders and bankers. And the richer the bourgeoisie became, the poorer the nobility became in comparison. And eventually the bourgeoisie demanded political power that matched their growing economic power. And so we had the bourgeoisie revolutions, like the French Revolution that overthrew the feudal system. But just as the feudal lords unintentionally created their own successors, Marx believes that the bourgeoisie will do the same. So the bourgeoisie, now the ruling class, created industrial capitalism, so a system of mass production based on factories. And this system transformed the world. So instead of agriculture, production now became industrial. So factories churned down goods on the massive scale using machines powered by human labor. But however, the wealth created in the system is not equally shared. So as Marx points out, the bourgeoisie owned all the means of production, the factories, the machines, the land, and while the workers, so the proletariat, owns nothing but their ability to work. So the workers had to sell their labor power to the bourgeoisie in exchange for wages. And Marx describes the situation as a necessary antagonism between two hostile classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And Marx famously says, "But capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of the law of nature, its own negation. It is the negation of negation." It means that just as the bourgeoisie overthrew the feudal lords, the proletariat will eventually overthrow the bourgeoisie. As capitalism develops, it creates its own grave diggers, the working class. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels call upon the workers of the world to unite. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. And the idea is that the proletarian revolution will be the final revolution. Once the working class seizes control of the means of production, there will be no class division, there will be no exploitation. The proletarian will dissolve as a class, because in a society where everyone owns the means of production collectively, there will be no need for separate classes. So you have seen that Marx's model of history is actually straightforward. It begins with primitive communism, where there is no private property and people live communally. Then, through the division of labor and the development of technology, we move into class societies. First slave society, then feudalism, and finally capitalism. But Marx's vision of history ends where it began, with communism, so a classless society where private property is abolished and people are no longer alienated from their work. And the final goal, as Marx saw it, is the reconciliation of the individual and society. So the working class, by taking political power, will establish a just society where no one is exploited, no one is a slave of anyone else. However, Marx insisted this isn't a matter of ideas alone. Revolution doesn't happen because the workers suddenly have the idea of overthrowing capitalism. Rather, it will happen because the material relations of production themselves come into conflict. So capitalism therefore will collapse under its own contradictions. And this was the first video about Karl Marx theory. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next week in the Literature Cafe, where we will explore surplus value, alienation and more.